Hi everyone and welcome to the final flipped collab for our unit. This is a presentation about the A2 presentation. So welcome. Now, as you've already seen from the assessment details, you'll know that A2 is our final assessment after A1A and A1B, and it is due in week 12, the Monday of week 12, which is the 30th of September. Now, this presentation is going to be about one of our assignment choices, because as you know, in this terrific unit, we have our choice of assignments. So this one is talking about the A2 presentation. There will also be a flip collab if you're interested in doing the multimodal report, but this one is just about the presentation. So it's a presentation for parents in terms of assessment, NAPLAN and other assessments that students use in the middle and upper years. So I'm not going to read out that whole scenario there, but I'll just give you a basic rundown that we're using the Captain's Chronicle, which I'll talk through today, to help us to give a presentation to parents regarding NAPLAN and assessment, and just to give them a better idea on how literacy concepts are scaffolded through the years and how we actually run assessments and what the benefits are for their children and teachers. So let's get started. Now, as I said before in the first two collabs, this is not supposed to be something that gives you all the information, because we do want you to come to the interactive collab if you're available and collaborate with us and get some more ideas there. So this is just pretty much Rachel's top 5 things to get you started, as we've had with the first two collaborates as well. Now, the first thing that you need to know to get you started with the presentation is to understand the concept of scaffolding literacy across grade levels. So you might be wondering what exactly we mean by that. So what it basically is looking for is the development of ideas. So as you can see, and I'm going to take you to the actual curriculum in a moment, that ideas begin in foundation, and they actually, some of them develop all the way through to year 10. So the ideas begin very basic in foundation in the early years of grade 1, 2, and they are built upon. So the skills are always there under the same sort of substrand, but they're built upon over the years. So as you can see with my examples here, we've got text cohesion, and you can see how each of the content descriptors build on the knowledge from the last one. Now I'm just going to jump out of my video for a moment and bring you back to the scope and sequence. Now I find this document a godsend, because when I'm trying to look at different content descriptors, when you're looking at the AC site, it will bring you individual content descriptors, not in any sort of scope and sequence that's together. So what you need to do is jump on Google and just type in Australian Curriculum English Scope and Sequence, and it will bring you to this particular PDF. We can even pop a copy of it. I'll make a note for myself to pop a copy of it in the A2 Padlet. So this particular version is the scope and sequence. So as you can see, as I'm scrolling through these particular substrands, that it starts with the strand of language and then it moves through each of the particular substrands. Now, why I've used this particular document is, as I was saying before, we can actually look up particular items and particular content descriptors, and they're all in that sequence together. Now, if we scroll right down to the bottom, we'd be up to year 10, but we just need to use these top pages that focus on foundation to 6, and more specifically for our assessment, just 3 to 5, which are the years that NAPLAN is in. So our first part of the assignment is going to focus around scaffolding literacy for students. Now we need to give a bit of a brief overview first. So let's go back to this presentation. So we need to give the students a brief overview about NAPLAN and about assessment. So we need to imagine that we have parents sitting in front of us that we're presenting to. Now, I know that students last time this particular assignment ran, they were a bit concerned about using too much jargon and not being able to really present well with the information they had to parents. So we understand that it's probably going to be a little bit more jargony than perhaps you would if you were really presenting to parents, because at the end of the day you need to be able to demonstrate your content knowledge to us. So there is going to be an element of jargon used throughout. And I think that's just something that can't really be avoided. So you're just explaining to us in that first dot point, which is the one where you're providing a brief overview of the scenario and a brief overview of how literacy ideas are scaffolded. So it's actually written in your assessment details as give a brief overview of scaffolding English concepts that happens across years 3, 4 and 5. It's a selected curriculum to prepare the student for the test. So basically under that first dot point, I would just be covering the points of the fact that NAPLAN does need to occur. I would be covering points like the fact that none of the content is new. What parents need to understand is that we're not testing students during NAPLAN on something that's completely foreign, that they've never seen before, that's going to make them completely stressed out. NAPLAN is covering everything that the Australian curriculum is covering. So you can actually talk in your brief overview just about how NAPLAN is aligned with the Australian curriculum and how the NAPLAN test is designed to test these particular content descriptors. So you can make your parents feel a little bit more at ease that when students sit down to do NAPLAN, that none of the material or none of the concepts should be foreign to them. They're all things, for example, in the grade 3 NAPLAN are all things that have been taught to them already in foundation grade 1 and grade 2. And when the students sit down in grade 5 to do NAPLAN, it's teaching the 3-4 content. So in my brief overview, I would reassure my parents that NAPLAN, maybe a little bit about NAPLAN is about, but I wouldn't go into too much detail about that because that's not something that's covered in the rubric. So just talk about how NAPLAN is scaffolding students' learning by the fact that it's aligned directly with the Australian curriculum and it is designed to test things that the students already know about. So we want to alleviate some of that anxiety there. Okay, let's skip ahead. Now, what we need to do is use the ACARA, which is the scope and sequence that I just pointed out to you, and use the Captain's Chronicle so that we can choose 3 literacy concepts, which brings me to point number 2, literacy concepts. So in our assessment details, it talks about that we have to find 3 literacy concepts that students have learnt to scaffold them in preparation for this section of NAPLAN. And you need to use the preparation material, which is the Captain's Chronicle, and we also need to use the curriculum. So we need to use those 2 things to help support our ideas about how these literacy concepts are scaffolded through the years or developed through the years. So excuse me while I pop out of my slideshow just for a sec, because I want to show you the Captain's Chronicle. Now you need to have this in front of you. You need to work with this. This is the number 2 thing that you need to do to get ready for this assignment, because as well as having a look at the actual reading that students need to do, these actual blue outcomes here or blue explanations are going to give you your insight into which literacy concepts you can choose and then relate them to the curriculum. So you can see here that for example, within the Captain's Chronicle, the students have to decide what kind of a text it is, and they need to come to the conclusion that it's a persuasive text. And then within this blue outcome, this blue explanation here, it talks about the fact that what the students are able to do. So within this first question, it says the question requires students to evaluate the information in the text, specifically the opening and closing sections, and they seek to persuade the reader. They're going to reflect on the purpose of the text, which is going to give them their answer. They then familiarise themselves with language and text features from a range of texts. So already within this blue explanation, I can see 3 literacy concepts popping out at me. I can see that students need to be able to identify persuasive texts. That's a literacy concept. I can see that they need to figure out, so that's the purpose of the text, which is mentioned here. They also need to be able to identify language and text features. So that's also a literacy concept which you could choose. They also need to be able to evaluate information in the text. So there's 3 literacy concepts just within that first section of the Captain's Chronicle. And you could use examples of this to help support what you're saying in your presentation. In the interactive collab, I will give you specific examples. I can't do that here because we're trying to keep the time limit down, but in the interactive collab, we will talk through each of these individual examples. If you have a look at your first paragraph here, you've got things like the fact that this question is based on inference. Inference is from that broader heading of comprehension strategies. If you have a look through the following ones here, they're not hard to find at all. Once you've had a look at all of these blue explanations, literacy concepts will come jumping out at you. So you might be saying to yourself, I've had a look at the Captain's Chronicle, I have gone through each of these blue highlighted sections and I've found literacy concepts in there. I might have found things about interpreting language, I might have found things about comprehension skills, I might have found things about evaluating texts. What do I do with all of that now that I have this information? And this is where the curriculum is connected. So now that we've found literacy concepts like that, we can have a look in this particular scope and sequence and look for matches. Now, what I love about using this particular scope and sequence and using modern technology is I can go to find and actually look up some of these key concepts. So say I wasn't quite sure where text features fit in to the Australian curriculum. I could look up maybe text structures, and I've found that within purpose and audience that there is an outcome which relates to students identifying text structures and features. Now I do have to be careful because that's a grade 2 outcome and it doesn't match with 3, 4 and 5, so we'd need to go to the next one. And we've found something within a grade 4. So we can see that students in grade 4 are going to use meta language to describe the effects of ideas, text structures and language features. So that's perfect. That would relate great to question 3 and question 6. So I could have examples of this in my presentation. I could have elements of the Captain's Chronicle pulled out, and I could have my literacy, ACARA links also pulled out to make my point that these NAPLAN questions or these type of test questions are testing content that comes within the curriculum itself. It's not a foreign thing, it's not a new thing. We are testing to what's already in the curriculum. Okay, let's go back to our slideshow. So point 3 that I wanted to talk about as well is an assessment overview. Now you'll notice in the assessment details that it talks about in, I think it's point 3, that we need to give a brief overview of a range of assessment strategies across 3, 4 and 5. Now this is what the assessment details say it to be, which is a brief overview. You are going to go into much more detail about assessment in point 4. So tell us about assessment. Keeping your literacy hat on. We don't want to be too broad that we're not keeping our literacy focus, but you can talk about things perhaps like the fact that we want our literacy assessment to be an ongoing process. We want to gather information, we want to reflect on findings, and we want to make consistent judgments to improve student learning. We want to use both for, as, and of assessment. at different points, and we want this assessment to be able to inform our teaching so that we've got quality assessment that's going to help us to plan and help us to be able to move these students forward with their learning outcomes. So we want a bit of an overview of why literacy assessment in general is important. So you're going to need to go off and do a little bit of research just about literacy assessment in general. I found that literacy toolkit, I've been probably talking about it the whole semester, but it's just a great resource. It's Victorian government based, and that's where all of this particular information is from about quality assessment. And I think there's a few videos about quality assessment as well. So you don't need to go into any specifics at this point of time regarding assessment. All you need to do is give us an overview about assessment. You probably don't want that section to be too long because you would like to save some of your time for actually talking about particular assignments. So this is going to be something that's going to take up another probably big chunk of your word count or time limit in the case of this presentation, as point 2 did. So you've got your 3 concepts that have been scaffolded through literacy and through connections to ACARA, but this also is going to take up a bit of your time limit as well, because you're going to look at NAPLAN in more detail this time, as well as looking at 2 other assessments of your choice. Now, what's really, really important here is that we're discussing benefits and limitations. So we're thinking in terms of this as being a critical analysis. So we want you to look at both benefits and limitations of both. Now, you want to keep ideas broad in the sense that NAPLAN can be beneficial to the teacher in the classroom. We want the benefits and limitations to focus around learning though. So when I've got things like here, we don't want to focus on external factors. It means that we want to think about what's the quality of the data that we're getting back. So you might talk about the fact that, NAPLAN's done in May. Most of the time teachers and parents don't get feedback from NAPLAN until at August, September time. So there's a good couple of months there where you're not getting any feedback at all. So NAPLAN data can't be relied upon as a point of teaching for a teacher. You don't get the feedback quick enough for it to be able to inform your teaching or planning. So that's a real downside of assessment, because we know as teachers we want our assessment to drive our teaching. So we want to have a an assessment tool that we can do there and then. It gives us some insight into what the kids know, and we can plan lessons for them based on that assessment data. We can't use 4 or 5 month old data. Kids have moved hopefully leaps and bounds in that time. So we can't use any NAPLAN data to inform our teaching. So that's a big limitation. Obviously, you can talk about the fact that NAPLAN is an exam style test, so perhaps that's not going to suit all different kinds of learners. I don't think we should get too bogged down in the fact that it causes children anxiety, although I know that's important and kids don't always perform best under exam conditions. We want to really focus on the quality of the data that's given. So the benefits to the classroom teacher is that it could inform. It's probably used more beneficially at a school-wide level if you've got contact with teachers or can chat to mentor teachers from past pracs or this prac. Most of them would have sat down at some sort of staff meeting or some sort of group meeting to talk about NAPLAN data and assess NAPLAN data within the school. So it is used somewhat beneficially to just keep an eye on how children are tracking from grade 3 to grade 5 and see if there's any value added. So what I mean by value added is, have you progressed from grade 3 to grade 5 in terms of how much you've learnt? Because essentially NAPLAN is the same test for grade 3s, 2 grade 5s with some further questions added on. So they should be able to make it as far through the test as they did the first time and hopefully further. Obviously, there's going to be benefits to stakeholders and school-wide because I know schools in Victoria use NAPLAN data to inform things like strategic plans and goals for the school. So it might be if you've got access to a school that you could ask can they use the NAPLAN data to maybe inform things like strategic plans and goals for the school. Now, as well as looking at NAPLAN, you're going to look at 2 other assessments of your choice. So whether you want it to be 2 reading, 2 writing, 1 of each, it's completely up to you. Now, if you heard any horror stories about this assessment from last TP, it has been toned back and it has had things taken out. So we're lucky that we don't have to focus on speaking and listening like we did last time, which was a little bit tricky because speaking and listening doesn't get assessed really as a separate entity. A lot of teachers assess it during reading or writing sessions. So we have 2 assessments that we need to choose. Like I said, there could be anything, could be 2 reading, 2 writing, 1 of each, completely up to you, can be focused on different grade levels, obviously, but we're focusing on years 3 to 5 because that's our focus with this particular assessment. So something that's appropriate to students of that particular year level. So you wouldn't suggest something like a decoding test that would be testing like a running record style test because we can assume that all students can decode by this age. So we want to look at them in terms of their benefits and limitations as well, and we want to think about think about the purpose of the assessment. We don't want to just say the purpose is to assess reading. That's far too broad. So we think about what the actual purpose is. So I was making an example with talking about PROBE, which is a reading comprehension test. So I'd look at and critically think about what the quality of the data is that gives me from this particular reading comprehension test and what I think of it. How well does the assessment meet the purpose and what's the quality of the data? The benefits need to be explicit and focus on the above questions. So just keep your literacy hat on and keep thinking about the quality of the data that comes back. We don't want to talk about the fact that an assessment is expensive. We don't want to talk about the fact that it takes time to do. We don't want to talk about the fact that it needs a lot of photocopying. Yes, they are all limitations, and especially things like tests that take time, because I can understand teachers do get put off if they know they've got to do a one-on-one test that's going to take an hour. That is a legitimate limitation of the test, but try to also focus on the quality of the data that comes back, and is there any limitations on the quality of data? For example, if you were doing a read and retell, I'm asking the child to retell a story to me, but that doesn't really give me a great deal of insight into how much they've actually comprehended. Some students do well in verbal retell. Some students do well in a written retell back to you. Some students know a lot more about the test, but they just couldn't remember in the retell, and then it's not an accurate representation of how much they actually comprehended. Maybe questions would be better. So at least when I'm looking at those factors with read and retell, I'm focusing on the data. I'm not focusing on the expense or the photocopying or how it gets given to parents or things that are external. Think about yourself as a teacher in the classroom and whether you're going to invest your time and energy into this particular assessment because you want to get quality data that you can actually look at and say, wow, is this telling me something that's going to inform my teaching and planning with these kids over the next month. Something that we also have to have a look at is reporting. Now, reporting is a big umbrella. When we think of reporting, we naturally think of reporting to parents because that's something that we all do as teachers. So you can talk about the fact that NAPLAN reports to parents because it gives them a printout, it gives them a report, shows them with dots and things where their child's at. So NAPLAN reports to parents. But NAPLAN also reports to lots of other things. So it reports to the teachers, reports to schools, reports to governments, which are external stakeholders. So you could talk about that as well. You only need to talk about one element of reporting. So if you've talked about parents in regards to NAPLAN, you don't need to include all the other things that I've mentioned. Just include one means of reporting. So you've talked about NAPLAN's benefits, you've talked about NAPLAN's limitations, and you mention one element of reporting from NAPLAN. Then you've got your reading assessment. You talk about its benefits, you talk about its limitations, and then you talk about one element of reporting from that particular assessment. Now you might be thinking to yourself, my assessment, read and retell, is just something that the teacher does. I don't go and report to parents about my assessment that I've done for myself in the classroom. Absolutely. But you do report to your colleagues. You do report to others in the school. So not all of the reporting has to always link to parents. So if I was going to talk about my probe test, I would sit in a team and reflect on those results with my team members, with my colleagues. So a way of reporting that data is to colleagues. So I talk about the benefits of probe, I've talked about the limitations of probe, and I'd mention one way of how it is reported. Now, we have 3 assessments. 2 out of the 3 need to be mention reporting, and the other one doesn't need to. So 2 out of 3 are going to make connections to reporting. Now the presentation, I think my slide has missed a slide there. I did have a great picture there, but it's gone away. Now, our exemplars that are coming together for you are going to be a more in-depth look at how you can do your presentation. But what this one is involving is imagining you are presenting to parents. So it's either going to be you standing up in front of a whiteboard or in front of a computer, and you're going to actually film yourself presenting, in which you need to think about all your presentation skills and make sure that you're, we can hear you and you've got a good tone of voice. So think about all your presentation skills in terms of presenting in front of an actual whiteboard, and just film yourself. Film yourself talking and film yourself explaining. If you're a little bit shy to do that, then you could do something like what I'm doing now, which is a screencast. So I'm talking through my microphone and it's recording what I'm saying, and I could have slides, make myself a PowerPoint show and have slides talking about it. You can upload it to YouTube and then we will mark from that particular link. So it has to be some form of presenting. They're probably the 2 most obvious and easiest ones. If you're more interested in making some sort of interesting presentation, you're probably more likely to go with the multimodal report, because this really is a presentation to parents. We have to imagine that parents were sitting in front of us ready to hear about NAPLAN and ready to hear about how we're going to help their kids through it. So if you're interested in Padlets and all other sorts of technology, you're probably better off to choose a multimodal report, because this one is more around presenting to parents. So whether you screencast or whether you present yourself is up to you. In the interactive collab and in the exemplar, we will give you more examples on presentation. So to give you an overview, you need to know about how you're going to scaffold literacy ideas from grades 3 to 5. We will help you with that in the interactive collab. In the interactive collab, I am going to pull literacy concepts out of the Captain's Chronicle for you, and I'm going to align it with the AC for you, and I'm going to talk about how I do that. You need to know about assessment. So start reading chapters, starts from chapters, week 8, all of the assessment stuff starts. So you need to be reading the learning materials, but you also need to read further than that. You need to choose NAPLAN. That one's specified to you, but you get to choose 2 other assessments. Can be reading, writing, or a mixture of both. And you need to focus on something that's applicable to grades 3 to 5, something that middle to upper years. And you're going to share the benefits and limitations of those, and a connection for 2 out of the 3 to reporting to parents or stakeholders or colleagues. There's going to be some aspect of reporting. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the interactive collab.